Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of the Scoot Space podcast. Today we have Neal Potter and Brad Crompton, and what we will be discussing is cyber threat intelligence, the differences between the military world and the commercial world. But before we get into it, let's do a round of introductions. Neal, I'll come to yourself first.
Hi, I'm head of SecOps at JustEat Takeaway. I've been here for nearly 5 years now, and it has been an absolutely wild ride. I started as a security engineer and then quite quickly moved into leadership. The journey that I've been on, we've done some seriously amazing things. We've brought the SOC in-house. We've done huge tech stack updates and refreshes as well, but also dealing with a lot of security incidents, the kind of which I'd never thought I'd see working for JustEat Takeaway. It's been extremely interesting. Before that, I did data engineering for CGI, working on the Ministry of Defence SOC. Before that, I worked for Summerford Associates as a Splunk consultant, and that was my first real job after leaving the Navy. That was definitely a trial by fire. In the Navy, I did cyber threat intelligence for 5 years. If you know what it's like to be in the military, that's a very long draft. And it was an interesting role. I was on a very loose leash back then. It was a case of, Neal, you're joining this civilian team, generate cyber threat intelligence products on this target, and go away and do it. That led me to solving data problems by myself because I didn't have the tools available to do it, or I wasn't used to using those tools. And I learned a bit of Python to manipulate large data sets into something a bit more useful and actionable. Before that, though, before my Navy career, I did a few things and failed a few things. I was a teacher. I failed that, but that's where I met my wife. And it's the hardest job I've ever done. It's much harder than going to Afghanistan and getting shot at. I was a tree surgeon for a little while, and also the very first thing I did after leaving university was going into astronomy.
Wow, okay, so quite the life you've had before security, isn't it?
Quite some variety, yeah.
Brad, over to yourself, mate.
Yeah, so Brad Crompton, the director of EMEA at Flashpoint. I've been at Flashpoint for nearly a year now. Previous background, though, similar to yourself, I started out in the Army, British Army Intelligence Corps, as an intelligence operator. Was attached to some great units, done a wide variety of different intelligence disciplines, absolutely loved it. When I left the Army, I was then quite lucky, quite fortunate to go into some really great companies. So when I left, I joined a company called CRISP, which is now called Resolver. There, I managed a team that set up a 24/7 monitoring capability for some of the world's leading fashion brands, and then also worked with various different law enforcement entities trying to combat the radicalization of individuals online. Moved on from there, and then I worked at a company called Intel 471 as a CTI vendor. Moved on from that, and then became the director of CTI at PaySafe down in London. Again, another amazing company, doing some really good things in the fintech space. And then after that, moved into Flashpoint as their director of EMEA. Unlike yourself, Neal, I didn't have a wide background like you, being a tree surgeon or anything like that. I joined the Army straight from school. So joined the Army straight from school, and then that was me until where I am now. Yeah.
Okay,
thanks,
perfect. Mate. Thank you very much for that, chaps. So let's delve in with the first question then. So what I wanted to sort of ask is, firstly, the core difference in objectives. So obviously in the military, you're responsible for national security, whereas in the commercial world, a little bit more concerned about business continuity. Brad, I'll come to you first. The actual overhanging objectives of CTI then in these two worlds, how do they differ? How are they the same? What's your thoughts?
The asset, well, the objectives themselves are very similar because the assets are always going to be similar in itself. Like, you're going to need to protect an asset, whether that's, a system in terms of CTI, or whether that's a person in terms of a military thing, or a unit. So realistically, that won't change too much. You have an objective to achieve. It's just that you both apply different mindsets to it. So from a commercial side, you have different teams that do a particular job, and they're set in their roles and what they should and shouldn't do, and they have a particular objective to achieve within that limit. Whereas the military, it won't stop. You will have an objective with probably more limited resources, or heavily limited resources, and then you have to achieve that objective along with other objectives along the way. It's not just, this is your ballpark, you do it, and then it stops. You're like an octopus with many hands, so you will have to do a bit of everything along the way to make up for that. However, generally speaking, you have an objective and you have to achieve it on both sides to protect a particular asset in that case.
That's similar to what we were discussing off camera, weren't it, Neal? What's your sort of thoughts on that?
I think to use the threat intelligence cycle, properly in a business, you've got to understand what is important to the business. For me, it's protecting business processes. It's not about any specific asset. It's more that we're able to continue to do something, and that's deliver takeaways, basically. There's a lot behind the scenes that makes that happen, and understanding that architecture and where its strengths and weaknesses lie based on real-world threats is really important to ensuring that that business process continues and is reliable. But the most important thing is understanding what the business thinks is important and the business needs to be able to continue doing what it does.
And that is the key bit, is the intelligence cycle should be applied to all disciplines of intelligence. Like, it doesn't matter if you're in the military or you're not in the military. Like, that first stage of direction needs to happen. If you don't have direction, then what are you collecting against? Because if you're just going and collecting against everything, your teams are going to be swamped. They're going to have too much data. They're not going to know what to do with it. And they're going to be trying to put out so many fires, they won't have any time to do their actual job. So that direction piece at the start of the intelligence cycle is key and needs to happen across the board.
And that segues very much into what I wanted to ask you both around the threat intelligence cycles. How would we've obviously just boxed off there about the objectives, but it does segue nicely into the intelligence cycles. And is that another difference between the two worlds? Neal, I'll come to you first on that one.
The cycle itself, I don't think so. I find the cycle itself you can apply to almost anything. You can go from a very technically detailed right down to data level process. The process of generating an alert in your SIEM follows the intelligence cycle. You hypothesize, you collect data, you process the data, you analyze the data, and then you report on it. That's the process of generating an alert with a SIEM. And you can take that from a very small, focused process right up to business scale. How do we need to have business continuity plans? What features do you need to build into your BCM to make it resilient against a cyber attack as well?
Agree?
Yeah, I would just outline, though, and I've briefed this at various different forums and whatnot, the intelligence cycle needs to be applied by businesses and at all stages of the team. So as a CTI director, for example, it should be your responsibility to communicate with the CISO, to be able to go in there and say, right, what are your priorities and what are you concerned about? That then becomes your direction and focus, which you then relate to the teams. That obviously from the CISO will come from the board of what they're concerned with, and they should know what they're concerned with as a CISO anyway. Once you've got that, you can then start applying the intelligence cycle. A lot of times, though, teams work backwards and they go bottom up rather than top down with the intelligence cycle. So they're starting with reports and trying to re-engineer the wheel backwards.
Is that a bad thing to do, though?
Sometimes, yeah. Yes and no. So if you're taking other people's reports, how do they know what's important for your business? Like, I don't know what's important for JustEat, but I'm sure Neal could tell me what is important to JustEat. Whereas if I gave him a report and said, this is important, and then he takes it and tries to apply it to JustEat, that doesn't always work. So it can work, generally speaking, with smaller companies, but for large companies that are the most targeted, it should be a focus from the top down with the intelligence cycle process rather than the other way around.
So to check my understanding on that, is that when it comes down to, I might be off on a different path with you here, but when it comes to just looking at technical IOCs, you can't just, it's not like a one-size-fits-all, and you kind of need that human approach blended with it. Am I right in thinking?
Yes and no. So yeah, the direction stage is you need to know as a team what you're looking for and why it's important. Because if you don't know what's important and why you're looking at it, why are you doing it in the first place? So yeah, I could give you 1,000 IOCs, but why do they matter? And if you don't know why they matter, then there's no point in you doing it. You're doing a pointless job. So if you've got 1,000 IOCs for various different systems that aren't even in use, what's the point in the IOCs? The same goes with your tech stack, and you look at vulnerabilities. If you're looking at vulnerabilities, well, are they even in your tech stack, or are you just going to look at all of the vulnerabilities? Because if you did, Vuln teams struggle as it is to deal with the amount of vulnerabilities. If you don't know what's in your tech stack and what's being removed and what's being added, and that's not constantly being updated, it's going to be a world of hair for everyone.
Yeah, the noise can drown you. Do you agree, Neal?
Yeah, knowing what you have is really important. But you can apply the intelligence cycle to just getting to the point where you know what you have as well, and continually do that. In fact, you have to, because I don't know about what other people find, but our environment changes all the time. We've got a lot of developers, and they're introducing new things into our environment and deprecating old things, hopefully, all the time.
So, chaps, just to move it on a little bit. So, I wanted to discuss a little bit of how geopolitical geopolitics actually affects both your world, and how it has sort of changed during your time in the Navy, during your time in the Army, and now in the enterprise world. So Neal, geopolitics, how does it affect you, and how has it affected you in the past?
Well, right now we have a brand in Israel, so the current situation is very difficult over there, and obviously that profoundly affects our ability to operate our brand in that country, and it has done in the past as well. That particular brand has also been targeted by activists in the past, not successfully, but they are targeted, and we have to be aware of the threat environment and the extra attention that any given national brand may attract just because of where they operate.
Yeah. Brad?
Yeah, so from my side, geopol plays in massively to everything. So especially in the public sector space, like that will impact every single priority that happens, or governments and various different public sector entities assigned to various different risks. But from a commercial standpoint, it also then creates targets for companies. So look at Russia, Ukraine. You saw companies being targeted because they were either involved in Russia or involved with Ukraine, and the same will go for Israel, Iran now, or Israel, Palestine. Companies that were supporting Israel were then being targeted. Companies that were not supporting Israel were conversely being targeted by other groups. It creates a complete political divide that then bleeds into the cyberspace. And because most people have a laptop or at least some form of computer, and they can go online and learn how to do all these nefarious acts, realistically your battlefield is huge of the amount of people that could then target these businesses. And as we've seen recently with like M&S and whatnot, the impact that a cyber attack can have is huge, just from one or two or three people that could target that particular company.
It's not just cyber attacks, though, that geopolitics informs. There is quite a big conversation going on now because of the sort of EU-USA political tensions, and people are starting to think, because all the big cloud providers are based in the USA, can we rely on them anymore? Should we look at making ourselves a little bit more agile, or move our tech stack to an EU hosting provider, even though they are a decade behind any of the bigger ones in terms of capability? People are starting to think very seriously about the implications of having to rely on a cloud service that's controlled by a government that's not so friendly anymore.
And I think to kind of come in on that and offer my 2 pence for what it's worth is, you've both touched on the importance of sort of communicating risk to the boardroom, and how it is an absolute necessity these days. And I suppose what to bring in the geopolitical angle on this as well is essentially this war that's happening right now. It's not just like, it's not like the World War I, World War II, where it's happening all on the battlefield. It's not. It is happening in boardrooms now, and it is happening digitally as well. And therefore, companies that are ignoring cyber threat, they're ignoring a huge part of what is a massive influence these days. And I suppose, like, my next question is, like, are you coming across, your clients, and have they still got this archaic view that, like, security, we've not been hit, or we've got no ties with anything on the geopolitical landscape? I'll be shocked if they don't. But are you coming across now, or do you think there's been a change in view where, no, everyone is welcoming now of threat intelligence? It's not just this Five Eyes, this security tool that's purely for military grade stuff. It's it very much is accepted in society. Brad, what's your thoughts on that?
It entirely depends on the business, which is a very vague answer, but it does entirely depend on the business, because when we talk about cybersecurity, it's not just CTI. So they may be very open to, well, they are usually very open to various things like looking at EDR, XDR, and stuff like that, vulnerable management, vulnerable processes. Intelligence, though, is usually seen as a nice to have, not a need to have. And I would argue it's a need to have, not a nice to have, because if you don't have the intelligence, how are you going to know what could hit you in the future? And if you haven't had an attack, that's great. That doesn't mean you're invincible, as we've seen, across the board, like globally, there's so many cyber attacks. So, yes, to answer the question, it entirely depends on the business. And that mindset, though, is changing, where intelligence is becoming like a discipline where that should be involved as part of all cybersecurity programs. But again, though, things cost money, and from a business point of view, if you've just spent hundreds of thousands on an EDR and an XDR, and you're told that's going to do everything that you needed to do, why do you need a CTI analyst and a CTI tool? Arguably, like I've said, you do need that, and you should have that in place as a paramount thing. However, it sometimes can come down to budgets, and as we all know, budgets are not always there until an attack happens, which is never a good way. It's sort of putting the cart before the horse, but unfortunately that is just the way things are sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think you need it necessarily as a specific person's role, but you do need it as a function you fulfill. Any security team needs it as something they do. Depending on what your business does, you need to get deeper or less deep into that. And knowing what the business needs is really what it comes down to. We have to consume a lot of external threat intelligence to do what we do. We don't have the dedicated resource to generate reports like that our own, but we do ingest those external reports and put them through a cycle of our own and make it relevant and then disseminate it to our internal customers. But it's not a dedicated role either. It's just part of what the SecOps team does.
And I think that's key, what Neal's just said then, in terms of taking reports and making it applicable to your business. Like, you're never going to have a solution that says this is important to specifically you, unless you've got a person in that role. And again, more headcount, more people, it's going to take up a lot of resource to be able to do it. So yeah, I do completely agree with that. And that leads back to the first question of where we said, well, if people have a box that they sit in and that's their role, then when you tell them to do it another part, which is not their role, and extend that role, is when it becomes applying that military mindset to things and saying, well, you need to adapt to these things and say, well, this is also part of your role and this is why it's important and what we need to do.
Chaps, you're making it this too easy for me, because that leads exactly on to where I wanted to take this next. And it is essentially about, again, Neal, what we were chatting about off camera, in the sense of like your actual day-to-day jobs and how they've changed and how the workflow's changed. Now, for context, myself and Neal were chatting about how in the military it's very regimented, it's very much procedure driven, it's very much like you might not even be able to see the fruits of your labour when you've worked on a particular project. You might have to hand that up the chain, or you might finish your tour, whatever it might be, and that can have an effect on culture, because you might have to hand over all this hard work and you go off. Back into the commercial world, I assume that you see the fruits of your labour a little bit more, and you can have a little bit more influence over your work. You might have a little bit more context, a little bit emotional, more attachment to it. But again, I might be wrong. So, Brad, I'll come to you first. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it again entirely depends. My experience in the military in core, like you are there to provide your information and your feedback, your analysis to the commander. Obviously, you don't tell them what decisions to make. That's their responsibility to be able to do that. But you advise and inform. So you still have that influence on what you need to have, and you are always listened to. Now, again, in the commercial side, you are always listened to. So for me, there's not really been any difference between the two. The key bit, though, is being able to communicate that effectively, because in the army, it is very much, this is what you need to know, and that's why it's important. That also applies to the commercial side of things. However, you need to structure it and phrase it in a very different way so that it gets to the right audience, because you're not just looking at, rifles and tanks. You're now looking at systems, why they're important, and a potential monetary impact of that. I mean, like, if you lost a rifle, okay, it's probably, a few £100 maybe, or a grand, call it for argument's sake. But if a system is impacted to a business, that could be hundreds of thousands, millions, whatever it may be. So the impact needs to be quantified in a different way, and it needs to be communicated clearly, or more clearly, on the commercial side, because in the military, everyone knows what the impact is from a particular event. Like, if X happens, the result is Y. It's pretty much black or white, really.
Yeah. Agreed, Neal?
I see, in the commercial world, I think, or it's down to the scale of a business or scale of your organization, to how readily you can see the impact of the intelligence you use. My experience in the military was very much, I was generating intelligence products for a mission. If they're aligned to the mission, great, they get reported, but I didn't really see what happened after that. Sometimes someone would ask me about them and give me feedback, but most of the time it was intel report, gets published, I'll just move on to the next one. Here, I own everything to do with that. So the intelligence is generated, we take some action, and then hopefully we can see that reflected in our SOC metrics or how effective our web application firewall is, we can see it providing value straight away.
So I wanted to kind of now ask you a little bit about the skills that you've sort of transferred across from both worlds. I know we've kind of touched on a lot of it throughout the podcast, but more of like what you've learned about yourself. Is it about the discipline? Is it what can the enterprise world learn from the commercial, given the fact you've transferred across both worlds?
Something I found was really important in both military and commercial world is what I did when I was an astronomer. Okay. The scientific process is very similar to what you do in the intelligence cycle, but it's about having a really unbiased view of your information and seeking to understand how relevant the data is with statistics and mathematics. It's not just a feeling. You've got to know what you're looking at is real rather than going off hunches. Nice. And that's been relevant everywhere. And I'm, even though I've had a lot of careers and a lot of failures early on, I'm glad I did it because those skills have really helped me later on.
Nothing from your tree surgeon days, though.
That was just fun, if I'm honest.
Brad, any skills that you've transferred across?
Yeah, I'd say sort of the resilience factor and being able to improvise, adapt, overcome, not to be too cliche, but being able to do that is important because you may find something or turn over a rock on the commercial side that you may never even known about, and you have to adapt and go, where's the system come from? What's this? Why is it still there? Yeah. And you have to be able to adapt that with the team. And then the other feature that I would mention in terms of that is really important from the military is that resilience aspect and being able to work at various different times when you need to, because you are in a commercial entity and yes, you do work 9 to 5, but you best believe that nobody is attacking your business Monday to Friday 9 to 5. Like that stuff is not happening. So you need to be able to hit the ground and adapt when you need to with your team. Yep. Conversely, though, that needs to be rewarded in both senses, which also comes from the military. Like if you've worked late on a Monday, then you don't need to thrash everyone and work, start at 8 again the next day on a Tuesday, unless something big's happening. Or if you are doing that, finish early on the Friday. Like the team's worked hard all week, and that's what you get in the military. Like you've been fragged all week, take Friday off or whatever it might be. Obviously, you can only manage that with the resource that you've got, but being able to adapt to those situations whilst also equally providing reward to people as and where it's required so people don't burn out is something that you do get from the military and should be applied commercially as well.
Nice.
100% back that up. The most interesting and some of the most impactful things I've done have been absolute curveballs that you don't prepare for. Moving into incident response as well and commanding incidents, what I learned about leadership in the military has been directly used in those cases. Clear, strong command and direction in a security incident is really important, and not everybody's got that. Learning that in the military was really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to ask you a question as me being the man on the street, and probably I've been ridiculed by my dad for too long as being an office man, for having these soft, unseen working hands. But just the gravitas of some of the incidents, some of the intelligence that you guys must have seen in your time in the Navy, in the Army, compared to what you see sort of in the commercial world. I'm being deliberately facetious on the commercial world, but the actual, gravitas of the situations that you've been in, is it quite impactful in the fact it affects human lives in the military? Or am I just being naive to what the commercial world actually is and it's just a different type of attack? Neal, I'll come to yourself first.
It's pretty self-evident when you're working in the military what the impact of operations is. I'll go back again, though. Understanding what the business finds important is how you add gravitas to what you're talking about. The dollar impact of an outage is pretty easily measurable for us. We understand that really well. And I could say, hey, if we were out for a week, it's going to cost us this much money. So we really want to make sure that does not happen. You're talking the business's language there. Give it gravitas by understanding what the business values.
Yeah, and I think each intelligence operator, for argument's sake, to use a militarism, they understand the gravitas when they're in the military because they can see it, just like Neal said. Also, though, their job and the impact of that is their reward, and they all see that. I don't know an intelligence operator or intelligence analyst that's ever sat there and gone, done my job today. Oh, gutted. They will apply that to the commercial sector as well. So they do see the evidence of it, yet the business hasn't been attacked. Great, that's a good thing. That means you're doing your job well, and that does get recognised. And like I said earlier on, businesses are understanding cyber now. They understand it's a requirement. They understand the impact. So that is also seen by various different businesses, and people are recognised for that, and teams are recognised for that. Because again, same detail. There's not going to be any business that says, "I'll rip by a cyber attack now. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine." Like that's never going to happen. And they can see the impact, and it's going to cost them, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, sometimes, depending on the impact. So the gravitas is there for the teams when they're saying, "We've done our job, we've done it well, and we've made sure the business is protected." Conversely, if the business is impacted, like Neal said about IR, then they also get gravitas from saying, "We jumped on this situation, we prevented further impact, and we stopped it where we could, or we managed it to a certain extent." That is also gravitas for the teams as well, being able to get that pat on the back and saying, "This is what we do here, this is what we do here, and this is what we do here." It's very rewarding for everybody involved.
Yeah, reporting what you do and being able to explain how it's effective, or when you know it's not effective and you're making some changes to make it effective. Gathering metrics and reporting on those to the people that actually care is how you get attention to your function when everything's going fine.
From the boots to the boardroom, it's been a fantastic chat. I just wanted to extend a great thanks to Neal and to Brad for coming in today and recording this podcast on a very, very hot day. So if anybody's got any questions for Neal or Brad, I'll be sure to put all the information down below. But once again, chaps, thank you very much for coming on the Screw Space podcast.
Thank you very much.